Okay, geometry fans, our topic for today, notes 2-3, logic and reasoning. So the objectives for today are to make a valid conclusion based on statements and determine whether a statement is true or false. So we're going to kind of build on what we did the other day and start talking about things that we know to be true or false, things that we know to be valid or invalid. So before we start, here's your joke of the day. What did one hat say to the other? You stay here. I'll go on ahead. I'll go on ahead. Okay, so as a review to start off, converse, inverse, contrapositive. So actually you have a statement here, a conditional. If two angles measure 38 degrees, then they are congruent. Now I've gone and already written down the answers, but you can go ahead and pause it here and then see if we agree. But if not, the converse, the inverse, the contrapositive, they're all related to this, which is the conditional. So this was P implies Q, what we call the conditional, and whatever comes after if is the hypothesis. Two angles measure 38 degrees. Whatever comes after the word then is the conclusion, or what we call Q. Okay, so I underlined that. I double underlined the conclusion. You don't have to do that. So converse is to switch. Inverse is to negate. Contrapositive is switch and negate. Switch and negate. So the converse, if we switch P and Q, if two angles are congruent, then they measure 38 degrees. The inverse is we negate P and then we negate Q, so not P implies not Q. So if two angles do not measure 38 degrees, then they are not congruent. And the contrapositive is we do both. So we switch P and Q and we negate them both. So if two angles are not congruent, then they do not measure 38 degrees. Now, one way to represent this, if you are more of a visual person, this conditional is we can represent as what's called a Venn diagram, as a circle within a circle, where the small circle is the hypothesis, P, and then the big circle is Q. So if you're in P, if P, then you have to be inside Q. The small circle is inside the big circle, so anything here must also be here in Q. So with words, in this case, if two angles measure 38 degrees, then they must be congruent. Okay, so two angles, 38 degrees, they're congruent. Now this is true. If two angles have the same measure, then they are congruent. So the conditional is true. Now the converse, if two angles are congruent, then they measure 38 degrees. Now we said just because they're congruent doesn't mean they have to be 38. So if they're congruent, that means they're in the big circle. But just because you're in the big circle doesn't mean you have to also be in the small circle. Let's say both angles were 55. Well, they're both congruent, 55, 55, but that doesn't mean they're 38. So the converse in this case is false. Now the inverse, if two angles do not measure 38 degrees, then they are not congruent. Well, if they don't measure 38, then that means they're not in the small circle. So they could be here, but they could also be here. Let's say it was 40 degrees and 60 degrees. They do not measure 38, but are they congruent to each other? And the answer is no. So in this case, the inverse is false. Now the last one, the contrapositive, says if two angles are not congruent, then they do not measure 38 degrees. If two angles are not congruent, now the congruent circle is the big one. Okay, so the congruent circle is all of this. So if they're outside of that, if they're not congruent, say they're 40 and 60, they're somewhere out here, then they don't both measure 38 degrees. Okay, I probably should have put the both in there. if they don't both measure, if they're outside congruent, so they're different, they can't both measure the same thing. Okay, so that is a true statement. That one is true. If they're not congruent, they can't both be 38. One of them could be, but if they're not congruent, then the other is 40, and that means they're not both. They can't both be here. Okay, so just to summarize, this is what we were doing last class. If a conditional statement is true, then the contrapositive of the statement is also true. And the words we use for that, we say they are logically equivalent. Logically equivalent. That's a V, that's a U. Equivalent. Okay? So if P implies Q is true, so is not Q, and that implies not P. We can make that conclusion. That would be the conclusion. Okay, so what we're talking about here is logic, whether we can make a valid conclusion or not. So one of the laws that we can use is this idea that the contrapositive is equal to the conditional. They're logically equivalent to each other. So what must be based on the following? What must be true based? Okay, I didn't write that correctly. What can we say based on the following statements? What must be true based on? Okay, I actually did write that. Sorry about that. Okay, number 2. If a polygon is a square, then it has 4 sides. I am going to write this symbolically. So I'm going to say if it's a square, then it has 4 sides. I'm just going to abbreviate. If it's a square, it has 4 sides. Now, the second statement says a polygon does not have 4 sides. So it does not have 4 sides. Well, that's not 4. So I'm going to start statement 2 by saying, okay, not 4. Now notice that this is like the contrapositive. This is the beginning of the contrapositive. Contrapositive is where I switch and negate. So not 4 implies not S. That must be true. If this is true, this is true. So the conclusion that we can make here, I'm going to say ... That means therefore, if a polygon does not have 4 sides, then it's not S, which means a polygon is not a square, is not a square. Okay? If a square means it has 4 sides, if it doesn't have 4 sides, it cannot be a square. That is a true conclusion. That is what we call a valid conclusion. Valid means true. Okay, number 3. If a polygon is a square, then it has 4 sides. So we're actually starting the same way. If a polygon is a square, what does that lead to? We know it has 4 sides. So let's say a polygon has 4 sides. Now, notice that the second statement is a little different from in problem number 2. Notice if I look at this, a square leads to 4 sides. Now, if I start with 4 here, that's kind of like the converse. You're going to be tempted to say that S leads to 4, so 4 must lead back to S. The problem is that this would be a converse, but the converse is not always true. So we are not allowed to make that conclusion. Now, if we think about it geometrically, just because a polygon has 4 sides, that doesn't make it a square. It could be a rectangle, it could be a parallelogram, it could be a trapezoid, it could be several different things. So just because it has 4 sides doesn't lead back to square. So since we cannot make a conclusion, what we'll say is no conclusion. Or you could say it's an invalid argument. Invalid is not true. Okay, we can't say anything. It might be a square, but we don't know that. All right, how about number 4? If it is raining, then I am carrying an umbrella. Okay, so rain leads to umbrella. Rain leads to umbrella. Second statement, I am not carrying an umbrella. Not you. Now notice that we start with the conclusion, we negate it. This is kind of like the contrapositive. So not you implies not are. That is a true conclusion. Now how would we write this in words? If I am not carrying an umbrella, not are means, therefore, it is not raining. It is not raining. And again, the ... that means therefore, in conclusion. All right, if I win the lottery, then I will have lots of money. Lottery leads to lots of money, okay? I have lots of money. Now again, you will be tempted to say if lotto leads to money, then money leads to lotto. That's not true though, that's a converse. The converse is no good. I have lots of money, well, maybe it's because I went to a casino and won a lot. Maybe it's because I have a job that pays me a lot of money. Maybe it's because I'm a teacher. Money does not mean because it doesn't mean that it has to be from a lotto. So I have lots of money, no conclusion. Not enough information, okay? If Katniss dies, then the rebellion will not succeed. Okay, so if she dies, I'll put D, then the rebellion, I'm going to write this as not S, okay? It does not succeed. Okay, if you've read The Hunger Games or watched The Hunger Games, that's where this is coming from. The second statement says the rebellion succeeded. It did succeed. Now, that's the negation of this, so that's just S. It did succeed. Therefore, the contrapositive would be S implies not D. That would be a valid conclusion. So if the rebellion succeeded, then that means, therefore, Katniss did not die. It's not D, so it's not this, so the negation would be she does not die or did not die. Okay, so some of these seem a little confusing, especially the ones that are no conclusion. Converse does not work. However, contrapositive does. And that's the end of part 1.